Hey guys, how's it going? Sam here, and today we're going to be working on part 2 of the world building series. In part 1, I worked on creating the 3D model, so I definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't seen it. In this video, we're going to be painting over that 3D model to produce what you can see here, so I hope you guys enjoy it. It's been a fun one to work on, so let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was an object ID pass. You can see that in the bottom right at the minute, overlaid onto the Photoshop document. And as you can see, I'm making selections from it. So I mentioned this slightly in my last video, but I didn't go into any detail and you didn't see the object ID. So in 3D software, I believe all 3D softwares can do it, you can export what they call an object ID pass, which is basically each object is assigned a new color. And the only purpose is to make selections easier in Photoshop. So for me, I start off with the object ID. I can use the magic wand to select a color, and from there I can cut out each object, apply clipping masks that I only apply paint to those layers. So as an example, I've cut out all the windows, I've cut out all the doors, I've cut out the building base material, I've cut out these steel girders, and they're each on their own layer. Now with the object ID pass, you'll see mine, it's quite messy. I've got a lot of colours. So as an example, if I've created windows using 4 different objects, if you don't merge those objects together, you end up with 4 different colours. Now when you're using the magic wand, that makes it slightly trickier. One, you've got to click 4 times rather than once, and also you get this slight hazing around each object. Now you can get rid of that with the magic wand, but it's a lot easier if you, in your 3D software, spend a little bit more time merging the objects you know you want to be the same object or same layer in Photoshop, and yeah, merging them in the 3D, taking the object ID, and then you've got that one colour. I didn't do that. I thought about it after I'd done the render, and then I was too lazy to go back and do it. But I kind of wish I did, because I did spend more time in Photoshop working over the layers, so that's something to bear in mind. So that is an object ID pass. I really recommend you use them. I've done a few videos in the past, and I've put some on YouTube where I've said it was a pain in the arse to cut out certain objects, and you know, this is such a time saver when you're working over a 3D model like this, so I definitely recommend using that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was my thought processes of how I went about painting this building. So obviously this is world building. I want to talk about slightly the narrative elements and how that kind of changed certain ideas that I had. I know at this what I want this to end up being an illustration, so I had to make certain decisions as far as colour that would create cohesion when I'm using multiple buildings. So I didn't want it to be too haphazard. I wanted a kind of cohesive colour palette. Now my narrative for this, as I pushed slightly further, I knew in the previous video with the 3D that I wanted everything to be slightly damaged, slightly worn. Maybe people don't have the resources to repair things, so they do it in a a haphazard way. Aesthetics definitely aren't the idea. It's all about function rather than form. To build on that, these kind of steel girders that I've put in to create the buildings creates these really nice, chunky, visually pleasing buildings. At least I think they look cool. But I didn't really think about why they would exist. Now, if you were creating a building out of these, they look heavy duty. They look like the building is going to withstand, a lot of weather. So why not push that idea? So in my final illustration, my idea is that it's in a world that's, damaging. So if you had our buildings, I'm from the UK, so if you had, the kind of buildings that are from around here, they'd fall apart with the kind of winds you get. And I like the idea of it being sandstorms, because sand will just rip paint from a building. So if you've got these kind of big metal structures, you're going to get rust, you're going to get scrapes, you're going to get kind of these polished areas where the sand's been beating, and also you're going to get some discoloration. So in window panes and the paint, you're going to get discoloration from sand constantly hitting it. I don't know if you've ever been to places where there's a seaside. I went to Spain recently, and all of the walls were painted yellow in this one town, and the reason was because the sand would turn it yellow anyway. So if they painted them white like they normally would, they would just be yellow within a few years. So they just painted them yellow in the first place to make it look a bit better. So going with this green colour for the building, that will end up, slightly changing. You'll get these kind of yellowy tones, brownish tones in the corners, or where the building's been hit the most. So that's kind of my narrative elements. to be honest with you, looking back at it, I could have pushed the narrative a lot further. I think it would have been a lot better if this building had a clear purpose. So my original idea was to be a car garage, but then I used a different 3D model because I thought this one looked better, and I kind of lost that idea, and it ended up becoming more of a generic building. So as far as the narrative goes, I definitely could have pushed this further. That's the one thing I'm not happy with. You can't tell what this building's been used for. In my head, I was thinking it's just accommodation, so this is where people would live. But again, narratively, I didn't add that much in. I added, a dumpster or a bin out the front, but I didn't fill it with rubbish to make it look like a bin. So there's missed opportunities in this piece for sure. So from the start, I wanted a formulaic approach to how I worked on this piece. I wanted to really understand how I would paint over a 3D model and understand what I need to do to make it look how I want it to look. And I've done this in the past with the bunker video as an example, but that was one of the first things I worked on over a 3D, and it was kind of haphazard. I was kind of finding my way around it, trying to work out how to do things. I never really had a clear process. So with this painting, I really wanted to drill down. Okay, if I start off with a grayscale model, how is the quickest way I can get pretty good results? So the object ID pass, like I mentioned earlier, that was the first step. That really helped lay out the document, so I've got a good document laid out with all of my masks, so I don't have to constantly be cutting things out or lassoing things. So that was step one. The next step was to create a color layer, which you'll see me do over and over. I create a color layer, I block in the color, I lower the opacity to what I think looks good. I create a new color layer or saturation layer. Now I've been using saturation layers, but I realized you can do it with a color layer as well. And if you set that to grey, literally as grey as you can go, as far left on the palette as possible, and paint over it again, it brings back greys. Now, obviously, if you're just doing one color layer, then you can just use the eraser. But if underneath isn't grey, then you're just going to be erasing to show whatever that color is. Whereas with a saturation layer or a color layer set to grey, no matter what is underneath it, it turns the base value grey. It's not changing the value, it's just changing the color. So it's really useful. So if your values are already set up, so in this 3D model they obviously are, I'm pretty happy with the value ranges from the render because that was part of the 3D process. I took the render and that's what I'm left with. So when I use this saturation layer, it's not adjusting my values, which is really important. So that is what I basically did on every material. You'll see me block in a color, then tone it back a bit, and then use a saturation layer to bring back some of the greys. I find that is so useful with metal as an example, because if it's rusty, it won't be just full brown, because as soon as you do that, it starts to look like wood if it's flat. So adding a grey in really pushes it towards metal, and then if you add a lighter grey value, it really makes it look like a scratch and as if it's been worn and kind of polished almost. So that is one of the techniques I used all the way through. After that, he was using I think it's a standard chalk brush in Photoshop. I might be wrong. I might have downloaded the brush at some point, but it's a you could create it yourself. It's a really standard brush. It just has a little bit of texture. I've always used the standard round brush for all my paintings for years, really. I used to, when I first started, I used a lot of crazy brushes, but then I got away from that and just realised I could do anything with the standard round. But I find it takes longer to add texture, it takes longer to add detail, and it can look more digital with the standard round brush, because you go one way or the other. You either really smooth things out, or you have these clear round brush marks. Whereas with a chalk brush, it looks more natural instantly, especially for damage and rust and things like that. It's really useful. And the smaller you make the brush, the more it looks like the round brush. So I found I could use that brush for basically everything. And you'll see me use it as the eraser as well. So one technique I have found in the past, if you use the same brush to apply paint and remove it, you're doubling up on the texture. I hope that makes sense. You're doubling up on the texture because the texture is applied twice in adding and removing. So as I'm working on this piece, I have kind of checklist in my mind, and this is something I want to go into more detail in the future with another video, but something I always do is to make sure I'm constantly checking my color contrast, my value range, how the silhouette works, where my focus is, making sure saturation isn't everywhere and it's just placed in one location. Now, that isn't as obvious with a painting like this because it's one asset. So if you make the entire asset, like the entire building, really saturated, that can work because it's one small object and you kind of want the viewer to view the whole piece. You're not wanting them to kind of hone in on one location like you would be with an illustration. So it's almost easier in a sense with this because you have to think about less, but I'm still always making sure that the whole piece isn't really saturated because it does just give your audience a headache. I wanted to make this piece quite saturated, but there are rest areas of greys and neutral tones, and that allows you to make real color pops. So with that checklist, yeah, that's the color contrast. And then with value contrast, you've got, again, with an illustration, you'd focus the area in one location. That would be the most contrasted area. And with this, again, it's one consistent light source. There's no atmospheric perspective, so there's not as much, but want to make sure that all the areas in shadow stick within a certain value range, so from just above black to midway through the greys, and then any areas in light are doing the opposite. They are going from just below white to the mid grey, and they don't interfere with each other. So it's a relatively complex thing to explain without showing, so I might do another video on that, but you basically want to make sure that you're controlling your value ranges. You're not adding all the way from bright white to black across the board in every different object that you can see, because you end up with a big murky mess that's too contrasted, that's drawing attention in every which direction, and the lighting wouldn't be realistic. So that's something to bear in mind. So as soon as you start involving colour, values start to change. So if you want a really saturated colour, you're going to need to lower the value. You can't go for a really white value and then add a strong colour, because it disappears. If you look at the colour palette, the further left you go, the more desaturated it becomes, and that's where the white is. If you go far top right, you're looking at the most saturated colour it can be, but it's darker. If you were to paint that in and then make it grey, it would be darker. So that's something to consider. Your value considerations and your colour considerations need to be made together. So you can't just paint in value and then hope that the colour you want is going to come across, because in certain situations, especially if you want to go for a saturated colour, it won't. So if you're going to do a value painting in grayscale and then go to colour, you need to know that you're either going to need to change your values at some point, or you're going for a desaturated palette, which is fine too. So with silhouette, I wanted to make sure that it's not one big block. You're getting little objects break out of the silhouette. So you can see with mine, I've got these satellite dishes breaking out of the building. I've got the rooftop kind of coming across. I've got the dustbins breaking out the silhouette. So there's loads of objects kind of breaking away from the main form. If you just did one building and nothing moved away from that building, I think it would look quite stagnant. It would look maybe less real, not as lived in. So that's also a consideration. Another thing to be aware of is the amount of large and small objects you use. I know there's a rule, I believe it's the 70-30 rule or 80-20, something like that, where you need the majority of your objects to be large, and then you can add small details to those, but it needs to be in the minority. So the way I always remember it, if this is the building, the big girders and doors and big blocky shapes that are in the scene need to take up the majority, and then you can add little details to them, like the satellite dishes and the windows and the aircon units and the vents. They need to be added to the building as an addition, not the whole item. By creating bigger shapes with a few select smaller details, it gives the viewer's eyes places to rest, and then also places to find the interesting details, opposed to it all just being one massive detail. It kills a piece's interest, I find. So I wanted to talk quickly about what I would change in this piece. I've already spoken about the narrative elements that I changed, so I won't cover that again, but that is definitely something I would change. As far as building a process going, that's why I'm creating these videos. They're not for a client. And how I would address them if they were for a client would be different, because you've always got to remember what the client needs them for. So this sits in a weird place between a concept and an illustration. I would say it's more than concept art because it's more detailed and the process took me longer. But it's not an illustration in the sense that no one's going to put this on a magazine or hang it on their wall. So it kind of sits in between the two. So that needs to be a consideration when you're thinking about your own work. And I definitely make this error a lot, especially if you're doing your own pieces, is understand, if you had a client, where this piece would sit. So for me, I missed the mark with this piece. It's fine for me because I wanted to establish a process. I'm okay spending longer on something if I'm learning from it, which I did. I've started to develop a process to get faster and faster, taking 3D to 2D. That was the point. But if this was a client piece, I would have had to have made it faster, because you can't spend a day creating one building like this when they can turn around and say, well, that's not what we wanted, do it again. You've wasted your day. With concept art, you need to be, knocking out loads and loads of pieces that look really different, and this hasn't done that. So this, for me, was to establish a process, like I said, and also to inform my illustration that comes next. That's just something to bear in mind. If you're going to push towards either concept art or illustration, understand the difference. Understand that concept art is part of a process of design, whereas illustration is the final product. It doesn't sit within a pipeline in most cases. Compared to concept art, it is a individual piece that you're trying to make look as good as possible. And you see that a lot in amateur portfolios. They're not sure what to do. I've been a victim of it myself, still am. Most of my portfolio kind of sits between the two, but it's because I'm focusing on learning. I'm lucky enough that I have client work come in a regular fashion, so I don't need to push my portfolio out there to try and win business currently. So I'm still trying to learn and improve and become a better artist. Whereas if I wanted a cohesive portfolio, I would definitely focus on either concept art or illustration, which is going to be moving towards now, which I'll talk about in another video. So that's something to consider. That's definitely something I would have changed. I mean, if I was in a different circumstance, I'd be looking at that. I'd be trying to push it towards more concept art, trying to be faster. You don't need as much details. You don't need to look as impressive. You can kind of block things in. You can smash photos in to get the same result, and obviously it'll be a hell of a lot faster. So I think that kind of wraps up the video. Sorry if I've gone off on a few tangents with this one. I didn't want to explain exactly what I was doing with the piece because I've kind of done that already. If you'd rather me kind of stay more on track and talk about the actual piece that I'm working on more, let me know in the comments. I think sometimes it's useful just to kind of discuss how I'm thinking about it at the time. But yeah, if you'd like to see more kind of tutorial based, this is how I paint these objects, let me know. But I hope you've enjoyed this one. It's a little bit different. Really enjoyed working on it, and the next video we'll be talking about the illustration. So I think it's a more exciting piece than this for sure. It's going to be a final illustration. You'll see how it all comes together and the things I do right and wrong. So yeah, if you haven't already subscribed, hit the notification bell if you want to see the next video, and let me know what you think in the comments. So I'll catch you in the next one, guys.